Number 16. Ashley Croser. 30-year-old Brentwood, Tennessee police officer Destin Legiza was on his way back to the station at the end of his shift one morning in 2020 when a drunk driver rammed her vehicle into his patrol car. The intoxicated motorist, Ashley Croser, was driving in the wrong lane when she struck the cruiser head-on. Legiza died from his injuries at the scene, making him the first Brentwood police officer in the department's history to fall in the line of duty. According to investigators, Croser's blood alcohol content was twice the legal limit at the time of the crash. After reviewing surveillance footage and other evidence, authorities charged the young woman with vehicular homicide by intoxication. She was also charged with vehicular homicide with a BAC of 0.08 or higher, vehicular homicide by reckless conduct, and reckless aggravated assault, resulting in death. Croser remained free on bond until the case went to trial in early 2022. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury found her guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to the 8-year minimum prison sentence with the requirement that she serve at least 30% of her term before being considered for parole. Croser went before the parole board in early 2024 and was denied due to the seriousness of her crime. Her next hearing is scheduled for 2027, in accordance with the board's recommendation to review the case in another 3 years. Number 15. Cameron Hughes. A British courier named Cameron Hughes was high on nitrous oxide, aka laughing gas, when he drove his van off a highway north of Manchester in 2023. According to authorities, the 23-year-old drove off the road after failing to negotiate a turn, causing the vehicle to plunge 15 feet into a ravine. His teenage cousin, Bonnie Barrow, was riding in the passenger seat and died from injuries sustained during the crash. Footage from shortly before the accident showed Hughes huffing nitrous from a yellow balloon while driving. He was giving Bonnie a ride to family dinner when the unexpected tragedy occurred. According to police, the young man experienced numerous close calls with other vehicles due to his reckless driving before plummeting off the roadside at 60 miles per hour. Hughes survived with non-life-threatening injuries and was arrested for the behavior that resulted in Bonnie's death. He pleaded guilty to causing death by dangerous driving and was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. The judge also imposed an 8-year driving ban, which will go into effect following his release. That effectively means that it could be nearly 2 decades before Hughes legally gets behind the wheel of a vehicle again. Number 14. Jessica Stahl. 25-year-old Lacey Lewis was found clinging to life in the middle of the road in June of 2022 after being struck by a driver in Parker, Colorado at 2 in the morning. She and her boyfriend were in a crosswalk when 46-year-old Jessica Stahl's vehicle barreled into her. Lacey's boyfriend was unharmed, but the young woman suffered catastrophic injuries that would later claim her life. According to police, Stahl asked Lacey's boyfriend if she had hit the victim, but returned to her car without offering help. She also failed to dial 911 and allegedly sped off as law enforcement approached her vehicle. Stahl led police on a brief high-speed chase before pulling over, at which point officers realized that she had her young child in the car with her. The cops also noticed signs of intoxication and took Stahl to the hospital for a blood draw, but nurses were unable to collect a sample due to extensive vein damage from intravenous drug use. They collected a urine sample instead and performed a drug test, which revealed the presence of heroin, methamphetamine, fentanyl, Vicodin, Suboxone, and Benadryl in the woman's system. Stahl was arrested on multiple charges in connection with the tragic collision. In 2023, a jury found her guilty of vehicular homicide while driving under the influence, leaving the scene of an accident involving serious bodily injury, leaving the scene of an accident causing death. And additionally, she was charged with child abuse. She was sentenced to 22 years in prison and will become eligible for parole in 2033 after serving roughly 10 years. Number 13. Alia Sierra. A baby-faced Indiana teen barely looked old enough to drive when she was accused of crashing her car and killing 2 people while high on drugs in 2017. Alia Sierra allegedly reached speeds of over 100 miles per hour while driving down a county road in Frankfurt. She ignored her 4 passengers' pleas to slow down and lost control of the car when it hit a bump, causing the vehicle to veer off the road. The car crashed into a family's front porch and living room, killing 2 girls who lived at the home and seriously injuring their mother. Sierra was charged with 10 felonies, which included 2 counts each of reckless homicide, causing death while operating a motor vehicle with illegal drugs in her system, and causing death while operating a motor vehicle while intoxicated. Additionally, she faced charges of causing serious bodily injury while driving intoxicated, causing serious bodily injury while driving with illegal drugs in her system, criminal recklessness, and criminal mischief. Many of the charges were based on a urine test, which detected the presence of opioids in Sierra's system. But a subsequent blood draw revealed that the young woman was sober at the time of the crash, and most of the charges were dropped. Sierra pleaded guilty to 2 counts of reckless homicide as part of a plea deal and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by 2 years of house arrest, then 2 years on probation. Number 12. Frank Martin Lawrence III. 22-year-old James Ackerman Jr. and his girlfriend Carolyn Buey were waiting to make a left-hand turn at an intersection in Mesa, Arizona in early 2020 when a man in a pickup truck veered into their lane. Carolyn honked her horn at the driver, who followed her and Ackerman all the way to their apartment complex. Later identified as 35-year-old Frank Martin Lawrence III, the enraged motorist did donuts around a couple's car before exiting his truck and punching Carolyn in the face through her open window. The rampage was captured on video by Ackerman, who got out of Carolyn's car and attempted to record Lawrence's license plate number as the crazed driver went back to his truck. It seemed like Lawrence was about to leave the scene when he turned around and sped toward Ackerman without warning. He missed the young man and charged at him again, striking him the second time. By the time emergency responders arrived at the scene, Lawrence was long gone. Unfortunately, Ackerman died from his injuries. Lawrence remained on the run for 9 months before he was finally arrested for the road rage incident in October 2020, while in custody on an unrelated assault charge. He was initially charged with first-degree murder, but pleaded guilty to a reduced second-degree murder charge, along with 1 count of aggravated assault. His inability to control his temper landed him in prison for 25 years, with a projected release date of September 2045. Number 11. Andre Mosby. A minor fender bender between 2 hotheads on Manhattan's Upper East Side spiraled out of control when both drivers lost their tempers and refused to think rationally. The routine collision occurred between a Volkswagen Jetta and a Chevy Silverado pickup truck on East 60th Street in July of 2023. According to prosecutors, the Volkswagen driver unintentionally struck the Silverado while attempting to merge into another lane. During the explosive argument that ensued, 54-year-old Roberto Velez Alvarez allegedly exited the Silverado with a knife in his hand and slashed 2 of the Jetta's tires. The Jetta's driver, 26-year-old Andre Mosby, flew into a rage and stepped on the gas with his wife and kids in the car. He then struck Alvarez with the sedan and pinned him against a building. Emergency responders rushed Alvarez to the hospital, but doctors were unable to save his life. Mosby remained at the scene and was arrested on suspicion of manslaughter and assault. He was indicted on the charges several months later, and the case appears to be ongoing. Mosby's friend Kamel Osborne told the New York Daily News that the accused killer was just trying to protect his family after he saw that Alvarez had a knife. But whether or not Mosby tries to argue for his innocence based on this claim remains to be seen. Number 10. Dean Kapsalis. A Massachusetts man made his racist sentiments clear just moments before he fatally mowed down an African-American man with his vehicle during a road rage incident in early 2021. 53-year-old Dean Kapsalis had failed to use his turn signal at an intersection in Belmont, sparking what would turn out to be a deadly argument with 34-year-old fellow motorist Henry Tapia. The 2 men approached one another on foot and exchanged heated words before heading back toward their vehicles. As Tapia walked toward his Honda Civic, Kapsalis shouted a racial slur, then got into his pickup truck and stepped on the accelerator. He ran Tapia over with the vehicle, and the victim died from his injuries a short while later. Kapsalis fled the scene but turned himself in to the police about a half hour later and was charged with murder. When the case went to trial in 2023, he tried to argue that Tapia's death was accidental. But the jury was unswayed by the accused killer's claims, and Kapsalis was found guilty of second-degree racially motivated murder. While awaiting sentencing, he made a last-ditch effort to mitigate the consequences for his actions by trying to get his conviction reduced to manslaughter. But this was also unsuccessful, and the original conviction stands. In early 2024, Kapsalis was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Number 9. Darla Jackson. 25-year-old Darla Jackson was driving her Nissan Altima along a highway outside San Diego in 2015 when she cut off a red Ducati motorcycle driven by U.S. Navy veteran Zachary Bourbe. According to witnesses, Jackson sped up and veered onto the left shoulder before veering in front of Bourbe, who was trying to merge into the fast lane. The two drivers proceeded to exchange words, and Bourbe kicked the door of Jackson's sedan before speeding off. Enraged by the gesture, Jackson chased after Bourbe in an alleged attempt to get his license plate number. During her frenzied attempt to catch up with the motorcycle, she failed to slow down in time to avoid hitting Bourbe's back wheel. The two vehicles slid forward in unison for about 300 feet before they became separated. And at that point, Bourbe was thrown from the motorcycle and onto the ground. Jackson ran him over, and he died from his injuries. While Jackson insisted that she struck Bourbe by accident, some witnesses claimed that it looked like she was intentionally trying to hit him throughout their interactions. She was going 81 miles per hour when she struck Bourbe's motorcycle, causing prosecutors to question how much of an effort she had actually made to slow down prior to the crash. Jackson was initially charged with murder, but pleaded guilty to a reduced voluntary manslaughter charge in early 2017. According to her defense attorney, she decided to forego a trial because she was worried about a jury's ability to examine the case from a truly factual standpoint. The young woman's lawyer also argued that she chased after Bourbe because he had dented her car door when he kicked it, and she wanted to get his plate number so he could be held liable for the damages. During Jackson's sentencing hearing, her attorney urged the judge to forego prison time, claiming that his client needed mental help that she would not receive at a state penitentiary. She was sentenced to 6 years behind bars with credit for 2 years' time served while awaiting the outcome of the case. It was far less than the 11-year term she could have received, but she nevertheless broke down crying upon learning her fate in court. To Bourbe's family, it wasn't nearly enough time. Speaking with ABC's 2020 during a jailhouse interview 2 months later, Jackson expressed deep remorse over her actions. She admitted that she let her pride get the best of her and that she shouldn't have been speeding or driving negligently. In hindsight, she knew that the tragedy was avoidable and that maybe she wouldn't be in the situation she's in if she had exercised better self-control. Number 8. Stephen Krusky. Love makes some people do crazy things and can instantaneously transform a vehicle from a mode of transportation into a deadly weapon. This appeared to be the case for a young Pennsylvania couple whose bickering and incompatibility ended in tragedy in May of 2021. 21-year-old Cheyenne Swartz and 26-year-old Stephen Krusky had recently broken up after dating for about a month. Cheyenne had ended the relationship because she thought Stephen was a liar and a people pleaser, but the two continued to associate even after they were no longer officially together. Shortly before midnight one evening, Cheyenne was found unresponsive with severe head injuries on a Mount Carmel street. She passed away 4 days later from blunt force injuries that were deemed consistent with having been run over by a vehicle. Cheyenne had spent the day off-roading with Stephen and 2 others before she was found clinging to life in the street. During questioning, Stephen initially told detectives that he had dropped the young woman off a few blocks from her house to avoid waking her mother with the vehicle's loud exhaust. He claimed that he and Cheyenne parted on good terms after reflecting on what a great day they had together, almost making it sound like they were still a couple. But based on what they knew about the relationship, investigators suspected that Stephen was lying. When confronted with the inconsistencies in his story, he admitted that he had lied about the romantic and loving farewell he had described during his initial interview. Stephen told the police that he and Cheyenne had jumped out of his moving Jeep during an argument about her drug use. He claimed that he got scared and fled the scene, unaware that he had run over the young woman as he sped off into the night. It was apparent based on the evidence that Stephen was driving at a high rate of speed when Cheyenne supposedly jumped out of the vehicle. When questioned about why he was going so fast, he said he was trying to get his ex-girlfriend to the hospital as quickly as possible because he feared that she was a danger to herself. But he wasn't driving toward the hospital when the mysterious tragedy occurred, and there was unexplained damage to the Jeep's passenger side door. According to court documents, witnesses said that Cheyenne and Stephen had been bickering all evening. Stephen supposedly bought Cheyenne cigarettes in order to convince her to hang out with him. Investigators also found out that Cheyenne had sent a text message to a different ex-boyfriend just 10 minutes before she was found dying on the pavement. Following an investigation, authorities charged Stephen Krusky with 2 counts of homicide, accidents involving death or injury, aggravated assault by a vehicle, and recklessly endangering another person. He was also charged with lying to the authorities, false reports to law enforcement, and 3 traffic violations. In 2023, he pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and homicide by vehicle and was sentenced to 25 to 70 years in prison. Krusky attempted to withdraw his guilty plea a few months later and was denied, but he won a resentencing hearing and is now serving up to 50 years in prison. Number 7. Braden Lafferty. A Florida family's lives were turned upside down less than 2 days before Christmas in 2023 when 32-year-old Kayla Lawrence lost control of her Cadillac during a street race and crashed. She was going nearly 86 miles per hour in a 45-mile-per-hour zone at 1:15 a.m. when the car veered off the road and went airborne, then struck a concrete power pole. The vehicle hit the pole with such force that its 2 front wheels came off and the engine separated from the transmission. According to police, the man Kayla was racing initially fled the scene in his Infiniti. Identified by authorities as 19-year-old Braden Lafferty, he then returned to the crash site and filmed the wreckage with his phone. Lafferty allegedly left the scene a second time and drove to his home, which was less than a mile from the accident scene. Instead of calling for help, he inspected his car for damage and carried on with life as usual. Cell phone data suggests that he also drove to New Smyrna Beach to carry out a drug transaction. Kayla died from her injuries, and it was only a matter of time before police identified Lafferty as the person she was racing. He now faces charges of vehicular homicide, racing on a highway, and leaving the scene of a crash resulting in death. In addition to the charges relating to his reckless driving, Lafferty allegedly had a handgun in his car, and the vehicle was both unregistered and uninsured. According to a police report, Lafferty told his mother that Kayla had tried running him off the road in a case of road rage. But witnesses told a different story, claiming that both cars were speeding and in separate lanes, and prosecutors are accusing Lafferty of driving around in search of a street racing opponent. In the meantime, Lafferty remains free on $51,000 bail. Number 6. Tara Harris. A fight between exes went from 0 to 100 one night in 2021 and ended with one party being fatally mowed down in the parking lot of a Portland, Oregon grocery store. Surveillance footage from the Fred Meyer chain appeared to show 48-year-old Thurston Harris being chased down the street by a Honda Element, which just happened to be the same kind of vehicle that his wife owned. In the video, Thurston could be seen desperately trying to outrun the SUV as it chased him around a utility pole and toward the side of a building, where the vehicle struck the victim from behind and ran him over. According to court documents, 49-year-old Tara Harris exited the SUV and tried moving her motionless husband out from underneath it with no success. She allegedly got back into the vehicle and continued driving, dragging Thurston's body along the pavement. Harris eventually stopped driving and waited for police to arrive. Thurston was still trapped under the vehicle when emergency responders got to the scene. He was no longer alive, and investigators had a lot of questions for Tara. The woman's daughter, Lachey Burns, reportedly told police that she had received a text message from her mom stating that she had accidentally hit Thurston with her car. Tara gave a similar version of events to law enforcement, claiming that she didn't even realize she had run over her ex-husband until she exited her vehicle and saw his body. She told investigators that Thurston had shown up at her house and attacked her after being released from jail a few days earlier. According to Tara's story, Thurston ended up running out of the house, prompting her to chase him in her vehicle to make sure that he didn't get away. When she caught up with her ex-husband in the Fred Meyer parking lot, she supposedly followed him at a slow speed while they argued. It was true that Thurston had a history of mistreating Tara, but in the eyes of law enforcement, this did not justify her apparent decision to strike him with with her vehicle, and while she claimed that she hit Thurston by accident, her description of the incident did not match up with what was captured on surveillance video. After considering the evidence and circumstances, police arrested Tara on suspicion of second-degree murder and unlawful use of a weapon. She received an outpouring of support from her daughters, nieces, and other relatives who attended her court hearing to show their solidarity with the accused husband-killer. Tara's youngest daughter, LaShante Harris, told Oregon Live that her mother loved helping people and was not a terrible person. She had raised 7 daughters, who all turned out to be good people. She had some prior criminal convictions, but they were all non-violent. After being confronted with the evidence following her initial court hearing, Tara changed her story about what happened. She no longer claimed that she unknowingly ran Thurston over, but now said that she had acted in self-defense. Tara remained in custody at the Multnomah County Jail while awaiting the outcome of her case. But sadly, she never got a chance to fully tell her side of the story because she unexpectedly passed away in 2023. She died after spending more than 2 years behind bars. Her death remains under investigation. Number 5. Ronald Gasser. In a perfect world, 56-year-old Ronald Gasser and 28-year-old former NFL player Joe McKnight would have never crossed paths on a New Orleans bridge in December 2016. But they did, and the situation ended with one man dead and another behind bars for what may very well end up being the rest of his natural life. According to news reports, Gasser became angry when McKnight allegedly cut him off, sparking a heated tit-for-tat between the two drivers. It lasted for several miles, with the men taking turns catching up with one another and yelling obscenities out their window at each other. Instead of letting go of the senseless altercation and getting away from each other, the enraged motorists eventually pulled over at a busy intersection to continue their disagreement. The argument escalated into deadly violence when Gasser pulled a gun and shot McKnight, who was standing unarmed outside his vehicle. McKnight was struck by 3 bullets and died from his injuries, and Gasser didn't deny killing him. He insisted that he act in self-defense when McKnight lunged at his vehicle, but prosecutors concluded that McKnight was posing no threat to Gasser when he shot the victim in cold blood. The state conceded that McKnight was touching Gasser's car window at some point during the confrontation, but there was no gunshot residue on his clothing or body. This indicated that he was not struck at close range and was therefore probably not lunging at Gasser the way the defendant described. After the shooting, Gasser was questioned and released, prompting protesters to take to the streets demanding justice for McKnight. Authorities charged Gasser with second-degree murder about a week later, and a jury found him guilty of a reduced manslaughter charge in a 10-2 majority vote. He was originally sentenced to 30 years in prison, but he managed to get his conviction overturned following a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that made split jury verdicts unconstitutional. Gasser was slated to be retried in 2022, but took a plea deal at the 11th hour and admitted to manslaughter in exchange for a 10-year prison sentence. For Gasser, this meant the difference between spending the rest of his life in prison and still having time to live in the free world after paying his debt to society. The new sentence came as a sheer disappointment to the McKnight family, who had to grapple with feeling like justice was initially served, only to be cruelly ripped away. But the conclusion of the case also enabled McKnight's loved ones to close a painful chapter. They were able to focus on moving on with their lives, finally giving them an opportunity to properly mourn his death. Number 4. Dale Williams. An Ohio man was so overcome with rage toward his ex-girlfriend that he didn't seem to care that people were watching when he ran her off the road and gunned her down in cold blood one day in 2017. 59-year-old Dale Williams parked his van in an alleyway in Youngstown and waited, knowing that 46-year-old Elizabeth Pledger Stewart would eventually drive by. The Cleveland area couple had recently broken up after moving in together due to Williams' constant paranoia that Elizabeth was cheating on him and his other mistreatment toward her. He was apparently unwilling to accept that the relationship was over. Williams made his move when Elizabeth's vehicle approached on her way to work during the morning rush hour. After running her off the road, he exited his van and shot her repeatedly, killing her in the sidewalk. It was a busy day, and a lot of witnesses watched the horror unfold, leaving no question as to who was responsible for Elizabeth's murder. After being arrested and taken in for questioning, Williams allegedly admitted to planning the crime in painstaking detail. He even had an outfit picked out for that day and a specific vision for how he wanted the confrontation to end. Following his arrest on suspicion of murder, Williams attempted to plead insanity but was found competent to stand trial. In May of 2019, he pleaded guilty to Elizabeth's murder. His sentencing hearing was attended by Elizabeth's sons, 23-year-old Jerome Stewart and 30-year-old Anthony Dees, who charged at him in the courtroom as he was waiting to learn his fate. The attack came seemingly out of nowhere, catching the entire courtroom off guard as the young man's sister prepared to read a victim impact statement. One of the brothers jumped over a table while the other ran around it. They then took Williams to the ground and punched him repeatedly while court officers tried to separate the fight, which ended after one of the brothers was tased. They were both held in contempt of court and jailed for 30 days on charges of assault and obstructing official business. Williams was taken to the hospital for his injuries and was back in the courtroom a week later for a second sentencing hearing. In the end, he was sentenced to 23 years to life in prison. Mahoning County Sheriff Jerry Green told NBC News that he understands how emotions can run high in a courtroom, but that fighting is unacceptable. But many people supported the attempt at vigilante justice, or at the very least, understood the emotions behind it. Number 3. Paul Ainsworth. The drivers of a Dodge Grand Caravan and a Ford Ranger pickup truck found themselves competing for space one morning in August 2023 when a two-lane road merged into a single lane near Chattaroy, Washington. According to police, 43-year-old Paul Ainsworth was driving his minivan in the left passing lane, almost directly alongside 33-year-old Rebecca Powelson, who was behind the wheel of the Ford Ranger in the right-hand lane. When the left passing lane ended, Ainsworth was partially driving over the center line while Powelson's vehicle was partially on the shoulder. Ainsworth allegedly slowed down, allowing Powelson to get slightly ahead of him, then struck the rear of her pickup truck with his van, causing it to spin out counterclockwise and then roll into a drainage ditch. The truck hit a large boulder before coming to a stop on its side in someone's driveway. Powelson was wearing a seatbelt at the time of the crash, but unfortunately she still died from her injuries. Based on tire marks in the road, Washington State Police Detective Troy Corkins determined that Ainsworth most likely sped up before striking Powelson's truck. A witness described Ainsworth's driving as resembling a pit maneuver, which is a technique used by police as a last resort to disable a dangerous driver who refuses to pull over. There's no practical reason for civilian drivers to use it, and it's extremely dangerous, even when being carried out by a trained professional, and that's because it doesn't take much for something to go wrong. The witness who compared Ainsworth's driving to a pit maneuver said that his actions looked intentional. Another onlooker told law enforcement that when she instructed Ainsworth to remain at the scene of the accident while waiting for police to arrive, he responded in a hostile manner and called her an inappropriate name. Both witnesses said the crash was Ainsworth's fault. Ainsworth, who was unharmed in the crash, gave police a slightly different version of events, claiming that he was unsure whether he hit Powelson's truck or if she hit his minivan. In the end, though, he was charged with second-degree murder and vehicular homicide. He remains in custody in lieu of a $100,000 bond. Number 2. Ana Valeska Jimenez. A Florida woman in her early 20s was driving in Jacksonville late one afternoon in April 2019 when a Chevy Suburban rear-ended her Honda Civic. Later identified as 60-year-old James David Robinson, the driver of the Suburban sped off, prompting Ana Valeska Jimenez to follow him. She dialed 911 to report Robinson's reckless driving as she chased his SUV in an equally dangerous manner and witnessed him striking another vehicle. Robinson was a habitual traffic offender with a record that included 3 prior convictions for driving with a suspended or revoked license. But by following him as he drove recklessly, Anna needlessly put even more civilians in danger. Police dispatchers told Anna to pull over and wait for emergency responders to arrive, but she was determined to catch up with Robinson. She continued to follow him at a high rate of speed while weaving in and out of traffic. The two vehicles struck one another several times during the chase, which ended when Robinson crossed over the median and collided with an oncoming pickup truck. This caused his SUV to roll and strike at least 2 more vehicles before coming to rest on its side. Robinson died at the scene, and Anna was charged with second-degree murder, vehicular homicide, and 8 counts of reckless driving. By refusing to follow 911 operators' instructions to stop chasing after Robinson, prosecutors said that she showed a blatant disregard for human life. If she had just done as she was told and pulled over, the tragedy would have likely been prevented. At the very least, she would not have been blamed for anything that happened to Robinson as a result of his own reckless driving. Ana Valeska Jimenez pleaded guilty to the vehicular homicide charge in 2022 and was sentenced to 8 years behind bars, followed by 7 years of probation and a 5-year driving ban, which will go into effect upon her release from prison. The convicted killer will be released in 2030 at the age of 32. We have another great video lined up right after number 1. If you need more of a daily world list dosage, then be sure to stay tuned if you haven't seen that one yet. Number 1. Maximiliano Farias. 19-year-old John Garner IV and his buddy Cameron Prince were walking through a parking lot in Crown Point, Indiana one evening in May of 2022 when a tow truck suddenly came barreling at them. Prince managed to jump out of the way, but the vehicle fatally struck Garner. Later identified as 37-year-old Maximiliano Farias, the tow truck driver fled the scene and was apprehended a short while later by Indiana State Police. He was traveling with his ex-wife, who had slept with Cameron Prince several months earlier. This made it clear that he was the intended target of her ex's rage, even though he had managed to avoid being hit by the truck. The woman told investigators that Farias never got over it after finding out about her encounter with Prince. She and Farias were on their way to a local restaurant when Farias spotted his ex-wife's former fling and began driving toward the men. The ex-wife thought Farias meant to scare Prince and Garner and was unaware that he may have had deadly intentions. After fatally ramming Garner with his truck, Farias allegedly blamed his ex-wife's decision to sleep with Prince for causing him to kill an innocent person. As detectives investigated the case, they uncovered more and more evidence to suggest that Farias had an obsessive hatred toward Prince. An officer who responded to the hit and run recalled a previous conversation with the accused killer, who had mentioned that a man was sleeping with his wife. According to the officer, Farias had bragged about smashing the man's windows and expressed a desire to kill him. Following the deadly hit and run, he was charged with murder and leaving the scene of an accident, resulting in death or catastrophic injury. The trial began in late April 2024, but the outcome remains to be seen. Number 11. Itzel Ramirez. In 2021, a shocking video was released of an Amazon delivery woman from Castro Valley, California, viciously beating another woman after a heated exchange of words. The delivery woman was identified as 21-year-old Itzel Ramirez, but the name of the 67-year-old woman she assaulted was never released to the public. The older woman apparently called Itzel the B word after the pair got into an argument, and Itzel told her to watch her white privilege. The 67-year-old was angry that her package was delayed. It's not typically the driver's fault when a package gets delivered late. After all, they're only doing their job. But when Itzel told the woman to watch her privilege, she unleashed the B word. Once that insult was said, Itzel snapped. She was then caught on film beating the 67-year-old black and blue. This is all according to the video in the sheriff's office in Alameda County where the incident transpired. Doug Smith, the owner of the apartment complex in Castro Valley where the assault happened, gave local news the full scoop. Doug said that the victim received an alert that her package was finally delivered. However, when she went into the lobby to pick up the package, it wasn't there, but the Amazon driver was. Itzel Ramirez told the woman her package would be arriving very soon. But for some weird reason, it didn't come. Both the driver and the victim waited around for 15 minutes, but the woman's package never arrived. That was when everyone's tempers started to run short. There was a brief exchange between the two women, and then Itzel unleashed her fists of fury. She punched the older woman in the head and body, landing at least 10 solid blows. Itzel even had her up against the glass window, where she continued to punch the woman in the head. Itzel was later arrested and held in jail on a $100,000 bail, while her victim had to get treatment for her alleged broken nose and other injuries. Number 10. Ryan Muncie Graham. Ryan Muncie Graham was working as a delivery woman for Uber Eats in Haltom City, Texas, when she was knifed by a pair of teens in 2021. Ryan was simply trying to deliver some food to an apartment complex when she found herself surrounded by teenagers with deadly weapons. The teens attempted to rob her as she walked into the apartment complex on Northern Cross Boulevard, but the robbery went wrong. The teens, who were 14 years old at the time, attacked the innocent driver and then stabbed her to death. In March of 2023, justice was finally dealt. Although both teens played a role in Ryan's tragic death, only one was charged with murder. 17-year-old Zachariah Marshall accepted a plea to downgrade the charge of capital murder to ordinary murder, but he was still sentenced to 45 years in jail. He'll only be able to apply for parole after he serves at least 22 years. His accomplice already pleaded guilty to aggravated robbery in 2022 and received just 7 years in the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. After the sentence was handed down, Zachariah Marshall apologized to Ryan's family for taking their daughter from them. At the time of her death, Ryan was working several jobs just to help support her family. In the courtroom, Ryan's stepmother said the night of January 27, 2021 was the worst of her life. Now she's looking after the children Ryan was forced to leave behind, and all because she was trying to make a better life for her family by delivering for Uber Eats. Number 9. Nathan Smith. After spending 18 months evading authorities, Nathan Smith was arrested and charged with murder in June of 2021. Nathan was responsible for the fatal stabbing of an Algerian delivery driver in London, England that took place on January 3, 2020. Takadina Budan was working for Uber Eats, delivering food through the city on a moped. He was in the middle of a delivery when he got into an altercation with Nathan, who was driving a white van. The disagreement soon spiraled out of control, and Nathan was quickly consumed with road rage. So he got out of his van and stabbed Boudin to death. But Nathan wasn't about to sit around and go to jail. According to detectives, he left the country immediately after. Nathan packed his things and arrived in Europe the very next day. He spent time traveling through Austria and Switzerland, just trying to stay on the move and stay out of jail. But then, after 18 months of his extended vacation across Europe, he made a grave error and flew back into London from Lisbon, Portugal. Nathan was arrested on the spot when he arrived at Heathrow International Airport. Following the initial murder, friends and associates of the victim called for better protection of delivery drivers in London. They said delivery drivers are often treated with less value than the food they're delivering. In another incident that took place in October of 2019, delivery driver Zachariah Garabi was punched so hard his eye detached from its socket. For the murder of Takadina Budan, Smith was jailed for life but received a minimum term of 21 years. He didn't have a very good defense either, considering the whole thing was caught on video. He was seen clear as day pulling out a knife and stabbing the innocent delivery driver out of pure malice. Now Nathan will likely never be released back into civilized society. Number 8. Chelsea Timmons. In 2021, during a brutal winter storm in Texas, a delivery driver was met with a rather unfortunate disaster. Chelsea Timmons was delivering groceries during the snowstorm that paralyzed the area. She was just outside Austin and was trying her best not to slide down the ice of her customer's driveway because the impact of the vehicle would have definitely smashed through their walls. Not knowing what else to do, Chelsea closed her eyes and prayed she wouldn't hit the house. And luckily she crashed into a flower bed instead. And while this could have proved extremely tragic, it turned out to be the right house for the occasion. Instead of being stuck in her car for the next 5 days while the snowstorm battered the state, Chelsea was welcomed into her customer's home out of the goodness of their hearts. These total strangers took in a random delivery driver for a full 5 days because she couldn't get her car out of the driveway. Homeowners Doug Condon and Nina Richardson tried to get Chelsea's Toyota RAV4 up the driveway and back into the road, but it just wouldn't go. Then, instead of making Chelsea sit outside in the freezing cold, they invited her inside to wait for a tow truck. What nobody realized was that it would take a while before a tow truck could assist Chelsea. The bad weather persisted for days. After almost a week, Chelsea was still living with the random couple. After all, she couldn't exactly walk all the way back to Houston. To make things stranger, it was Valentine's Day. Chelsea told the couple she could wait in her car, but they insisted she enjoy Valentine's dinner with them. Instead of turning into a human popsicle while waiting for a tow truck, Chelsea was served steak with blue cheese, broccoli, and salad. She was then offered a bed in the couple's home, where she slept for the next 5 nights. In the end, 5 days went by in a flash. Chelsea stayed in the spare bedroom. She enjoyed the couple's cute dogs, Crosby and Hattie, and nearly became part of the family. When the weather finally relaxed, Chelsea was able to drive safely home with the roads cleared and the sun shining. She'd even made some new friends throughout the ordeal. Number 7. Stuck nowhere. An Amazon delivery driver got so lost in California, they ended up in the middle of literal nowhere. The story of the driver turned up in November of 2020. They drove their Ford Transit van all the way down a 4x4 trail in the Golden State, all because the driver was following his GPS. We might not have even heard about this if it wasn't for the tow truck driver who pulled the van out of the muck it got stuck in. After the unusual job, Freddie Rodriguez from Cavalry Off-Road Recovery told the Drive all about the bizarre incident. The Amazon driver's GPS was supposedly broken and forced him down a dirt road used by people with 4x4s on the weekend. It's called Canyon Lake Trail, and it's not far from Lake Elsinore. But the issue is that Amazon drivers aren't supposed to disobey the GPS, so the guy just kept going down the road until he wound up so deep in the mud, there was nowhere for him to go. The Amazon driver's supervisor then phoned towing companies on Yelp for assistance, but 4 companies said no before he finally found Freddie Rodriguez, who agreed to drive down and pull out the stuck driver. However, instead of waiting to be pulled out of the muck, the driver phoned the police. He had the Riverside County Sheriff's Office deploy air rescue. By the time Freddie arrived to free the van from its sinkhole, the driver was already long gone. Number 6. Tanner Lynn Horner. Texas is seeking the death penalty for Tanner Lynn Horner, who was arrested and charged with capital murder in December of 2022. Not ordinary capital murder either, but capital murder for a person under 10 years of age. He's also been charged with aggravated kidnapping. And if it was up to the district attorneys in Texas, he'd spend the rest of his life on death row. It's not up for debate if Tanner is guilty or not. He already confessed to abducting and killing Athena Strand. The only thing still being debated is what his punishment will be. Tanner told detectives his version of events. He was working as a FedEx truck driver in 2022. On November 30th, Tanner accidentally hit 7-year-old Athena Strand with his vehicle. He told investigators that after he hit the child, he panicked and threw her in the trunk. Tanner was totally fine and hadn't been injured in the slightest from the accident. But he didn't want to get in trouble for accidentally hitting a kid, so he grabbed Athena and threw her in the back of his vehicle. Athena wasn't dead, she was just a little banged up from the accident. Tanner could have let her go, or he could have stopped and called an ambulance. But instead, he strangled her because she threatened to tell her dad that she was hit by a FedEx truck driver. And while this is what Tanner told the police officially, it's suspected he may have kidnapped Athena on purpose with the intention to carry out some kind of murderous fantasy. Athena was reported missing when she never returned home on November 30th. Her body was found about 10 miles, 16 kilometers from Paradise, Texas, 2 days later. Tanner was an obvious suspect because he was on the record delivering a package to the house at the exact same time Athena vanished. Tanner also had cameras on the vehicle that showed him kidnapping the girl. There wasn't any way he was going to cover it up, and now Tanner is facing the death penalty for the crime. Number 5. Bobby Jenkins. In early 2019, Bobby Jenkins was called to a vacant home in Philadelphia to deliver pizza, but when he got there, he was shot to death. According to the police, it was an orchestrated ambush. A group of criminals placed a pizza delivery call on purpose so that when the driver got there, they could steal his cash, his pizza, and his life. Bobby Jenkins was killed at about 7 p.m. on a Tuesday in late February. He was working for Stacy's Pizza and was delivering to the Overbrook Park neighborhood when the fatal events transpired. According to Captain Jason Smith of the local police, the crime was similar to something that happened just a few days prior. Jenkins was lured to the house by the criminals and was then shot in the chest and killed with a handgun. Afterward, the murderers fled the scene and were never arrested. Just a few days earlier, the same thing happened to a pizza delivery person 4 miles, 6.4 kilometers away. The callers used an abandoned home for the delivery location and had forced their way into the residence through the back door. And when the pizza arrived, they ambushed the driver. Jenkins was killed, but in the incident that happened prior, the driver got away with their life. Number 4. Jorge Dupre Lachazo. In August 2019, Jorge Dupre Lachazo delivered a washer and dryer from Best Buy to the home of 75-year-old Evelyn Smith Udell in Boca Raton, South Florida. The appliance delivery man then beat the woman to death and set her on fire. It was an explosion of cruel violence. Dupre brought the washer and dryer with a second man, as it's a 2-person job to carry such heavy pieces of equipment. But after the installation was over, the second man went outside. After a few minutes had passed, he heard screaming and ran back into the house. Once inside, he saw Evelyn lying on the floor and immediately called 911. As he was phoning the police, Dupre was hijacking the delivery van and driving off. Sadly, Evelyn was already gone by the time police arrived. When the authorities launched their investigation, they discovered a rubber mallet that had been used to bludgeon the old woman. They also found a can of paint thinner that Dupre used to set her on fire. When it came to a motive, the police figured Dupre wanted to rob the woman. They found that the victim's wallet had been disturbed, suggesting Dupre attempted a robbery but got busted before he could finish the job. There was no way he could have possibly gotten away with the crime though, since he was literally at the house with a co-worker. The police captured Dupre, and he's since been convicted of first-degree murder, arson and burglary. And although he was spared the death penalty, he did get life in prison. Number 3. Charles and the septic tank. It's not exactly clear where this story took place, but a delivery driver for Amazon found himself stuck in a septic tank in early 2023. He was simply identified as Charles, and he chronicled his journey into a disgusting pit of filth for everyone online to see. According to Charles's explanation in the gross videos he uploaded about the incident, it started with a hole in the ground. Charles was moving past a hole with a delivery in his hands that he planned to drop off at the customer's front door, but suddenly the ground went out from underneath him and he was falling. It turned out that he'd walked over the top of a very old and busted septic tank. Before he knew it, Charles was 6 feet 2 meters under. He had roots brushing up against his head and was thigh-deep in human feces. He tried to crawl out, only to have the dirt walls crumble in his eyes. He started to fear that the walls would cave in on him and that he'd end up entombed inside somebody's septic tank. The fire department did eventually come to rescue Charles, though. They showed up with a helicopter just in case, but only needed a ladder for him to climb out of the hole. The truly scary part about this whole ordeal, however, was that Charles was in a worse situation than he imagined. When the fire chief arrived and looked down in the hole, he told Charles not to move a muscle. The hole may have been deeper than it appeared, and if anything set it off, the whole thing might have collapsed. But luckily, Charles escaped with his life. Afterward, Charles took a shower and then went right back to finishing the rest of his deliveries. Number 2. To protect and serve. Anastasia Elsinger wasn't expecting a police escort to bring her lunch straight to her front door in January of 2022. Anastasia ordered some food using the DoorDash service, assuming her delivery driver would be some average Joe. But when there was a knock on her door, Anastasia found a Sioux Falls police officer standing there with her food bags. Their hilarious encounter was captured on her doorbell camera. But the reason the cop was there was less than comical. Anastasia didn't feel like cooking, so she ordered a wrap, some curly fries, and a drink from a nearby Arby's restaurant. When her food didn't show up, she checked her delivery app and saw that the driver was just sitting there a few blocks away, doing nothing. When she went outside and looked down the street, she noticed that her driver had been pulled over by the cops. Not wanting to interfere, Anastasia went inside to wait, thinking that her food would just be a bit late. But as it turned out, the delivery driver had an outstanding warrant. The police had no choice but to arrest the driver. But then there was the issue of Anastasia's food. Officer Sam Burr didn't feel like Anastasia deserved to suffer just because her delivery driver was a wanted criminal. So Officer Burr delivered Anastasia's food himself, even though it was a little cold when it arrived. In the end, everything turned out all right for everyone, except of course for the driver, who was taken to jail. Number 1. Angelo Ortiz. 6 years after the brutal slaying of Vanessa Marcotte, Angelo Ortiz pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. In August 2016, Vanessa, who was an extremely successful Google employee living in New York, was visiting the home of her mother in Princeton, New Jersey. During her visit, she went out for a leisurely walk. You wouldn't think going for a stroll could be so dangerous, but Vanessa never returned home. Then, on August 7th, just a day after she vanished, her body was found dumped in the woods about a mile, 1.6 kilometers from where she was last seen. Authorities say they found her stripped of her clothing and badly burned. She tested positive for gasoline, suggesting somebody tried to burn her corpse to get rid of the evidence. That somebody was later identified as delivery driver Angelo Ortiz. Court documents proved that on the day Vanessa was slain, Angelo purchased $5 worth of gasoline just 6 miles, 9.6 kilometers from where the body was found. But the journey from Vanessa's death to Angelo's arrest was a long one. He wasn't put behind bars until April 15, 2017. It took nearly a full year for the cops to find enough evidence to arrest Angelo. At the time of the killing, Angelo was 31 years old with a wife and 3 kids. He worked as a delivery driver for FedEx, primarily in the Princeton area. Police picked up his DNA from Vanessa's body when they conducted her autopsy. Then, by a complete fluke, a state trooper noticed a black SUV matching the description of the black SUV seen on the day of Vanessa's murder. The vehicle was traced back to Angelo, and his DNA was a direct match for the DNA found on Vanessa's corpse. Although it doesn't appear that any official motive has been given, it's generally agreed this was a spontaneous crime. Angelo saw Vanessa walking down the road and took the opportunity to commit a savage murder. He's now been sentenced to life in prison and will only be eligible for parole after serving 45 years. If a family member's car was suspiciously damaged on the very same day of a hit and run, but they insisted they had gotten into a fender bender, would you be inclined to further investigate to ensure that they were telling the truth? Or would you leave the situation alone, despite any lingering doubts about the person's honesty? Let me know in the comments below, but be sure to subscribe first. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.